This is the screencast for Lesson 25 in Stephen's C# 24-hour trainer. In this try it, we're going to build this application to draw some ellipses and rectangles. The way we're going to do it is we're going to start with a shape class that defines a default behavior for the other classes that we're going to create. In this case, we're going to create shape rectangle and shape ellipse. So what this class needs to do is it needs to define the behaviors we want the other classes to provide so the program can treat them all as shapes. The way we're going to start is any shape is going to need a boundary area. So we're going to create a rectangle. So I'll call it public rectangle. I'm going to name it rectangle. I'm going to call it bounds. And I'm going to make it auto-implemented because we're not going to do much with it in terms of bounds checking. If we have a valid rectangle, we'll just attempt to use it. Now let's create a constructor to make building a shape easier. So I'm going to say public shape, and I'm going to give it some parameters, int x, int y, int width, and int height. Those are going to be the coordinates of the upper left corner of this shape and its width and height. And I'm going to say bounds equals new rectangle, x, y, width, height. Now I'm not going to create a default constructor just because in this program it's just as easy to use this constructor. Now we want all of these objects to implement a draw method so we can do some drawing on the screen. So first I'm going to do this a little bit backwards to show you how you often build these things. First I'm going to create a draw method. So I'm going to say virtual void draw, and I'm going to pass in a graphics object that we're going to draw on. And what I want to do here is I'm going to fill this rectangle with, say, a transparent brush, or we could use some color if we wanted to. We could use white or whatever. I'm just going to make it a transparent brush. So I'm going to say brushes.transparent. And the rectangle I want to fill is the one defined by our bounds. That's why I gave it a bounds parameter. Not only does it tell us where the thing is on the screen for our purposes, but also it's very convenient for these drawing and filling methods. So there's our, we filled the rectangle with a transparent color, which isn't going to show anything really on the screen. Now let's outline it. So I'm going to draw a rectangle. I'm going to use pens.black. Now let's use red. And again, we use the same bounds rectangle. The last thing I want to do is draw a big X through the middle of this thing. That's going to be our default implementation so that we know if another class doesn't override this method, then we get a big X. So I'll use pens.red again. And this time I can't use that bounds rectangle. Oh, sorry, I don't want to draw a rectangle anyway. I want to draw a line. This time I need to give it X and Y coordinates of the start and end points of this line. So I'm going to say bounds.x, bounds.y. So that's the upper left corner. The lower left corner is going to be bounds dot right, bounds dot bottom. There we go. And then for the other line in the X, I want to start with bounds dot right, bounds dot y, bounds dot x, bounds dot bottom. All right, so that would make a reasonable first attempt at this method. We need to make a couple of changes to it right away. One is we want the derived classes, so shape rectangle and shape ellipse, we want them to be able to override this method. The intent of this method really isn't to draw a pure shape object. It's to override that and draw something derived from it. So I'm going to change this to a virtual method. So now we have a virtual draw method. Now the other change that I want to make is this version doesn't take colors as a parameter. It simply takes a graphics object and it draws a transparent box with a red outline. Well, that may be what you want, but you may also want one where you pass in specific colors. So you could make a green box or a blue box. So let's create a new version. This is an overloaded version of this method that takes extra parameters. So I'm going to say public virtual, because I also want to be able to override this one, draw graphics gr, and then now the other parameters. So I'm going to pass in a brush and a pen. So brush, I'll call this brush, and pen, we'll call that pen. So what do I want this thing to do? Well, I want it to do the same things that this method did down here. So I could repeat all this code, but really what I want is a common method that they can both use. You could write a separate method here, a third method that does the actual drawing, but that's really not necessary in this case. In this case, this method is the more specific method of the two. This one uses some default values. This one uses specific brush and pen values. So I'm going to take this code and move it up into here. And I'm going to get rid of these calls to brush transparent and pens.red. And I'm going to replace them with the parameters that we were passed in here. So now we pass these parameters in, and this method will draw our shape for us using the brush and the pen that we're given. So now down here, how do we fix this one? Well, we can have it call the other version of draw, passing in the correct parameters. So we'll pass in our graphics object. Now we need to pass in the brush, and now we use brushes.transparent, and the pen, we'll use pens.red. So as I said, this is kind of a backwards, roundabout way to do this, but it's pretty common for real development projects, where you start off with a simpler method, you then generalize it. So in this case, we allowed the user to pass in some extra parameters, and then we can use that more general version to implement the more specific version, this default method. All right, so there's a shot at our shape class. Let's look at the shape ellipse class. I've just built the stub here, so the shape ellipse class inherits from the shape class. And what we would like to do, well, let's run the program and see if it works. I'm not sure what will happen. Let's take a look at the main program so you can see what happens in here. Oh, we need to create some constructors for the shape ellipse class. It won't work without those. So let's go ahead and do that. So here we're going to have public shape ellipse. And I want to give it a constructor similar to the one that I created for the shape class over here that takes these 4 parameters. So I'm just going to copy these parameters and paste them into this constructor. What is it complaining about? Oh, okay. Yeah, it's complaining because the shape class doesn't contain a constructor that takes no parameters. And by default, if we don't tell this what to do, it's going to try to invoke that constructor. But we don't really want to do that anyway. So what we're going to do is have this constructor invoke the shape class's constructor. And IntelliSense here shows us there's only one version of the constructor. That's good because that's the version we want. So we'll just pass that constructor the parameters that we've been given. So now when you create a shape ellipse class using this constructor, it invokes the shape class's constructor, passing it these parameters. So now let's go back to the main program, and it's much happier now because it can create these objects. So with the form loaded, well, let's look out here for starters. There's a field that's available outside of all the methods in this class called shapes. It's a list of shape objects. The form's load event handler creates some shape objects. It creates several shape ellipses up here, and then it creates some shape rectangles down here. And I won't walk you through the shape rectangle class. It's very similar to the shape ellipse class, except it draws rectangles instead of ellipses. Down here in the paint event handler, we call, what it does is it clears the graphics object for each shape in shapes, so it's going to loop through our shape list. If the color checkbox is checked, you can see that up here, then it calls the shape object's draw method, passing it a graphics object, a blue pen, and a light blue brush. If the checkbox is not checked, it just calls the object's draw method without any parameters. You recall we made 2 versions of the draw method, one that takes these parameters and one that doesn't. So let's see what the problem is here. Let's see, the best overloaded method has some invalid arguments. So let's let IntelliSense tell us what's wrong. Oh, I switched the order of these things. Here we've got the pen first and the brush second. I better change that because I'm sure the shape rectangle class works similarly to these. So let's go back over here and we'll put the pen first. Let's go back in here and see, now it's happy. So let's run the program and see what happens. We've got all these ellipses and rectangles that the main program creates, and then it draws them in its paint event handler. And it's still not happy. It's the same problem. I used this simpler version of draw, invoked the more complicated version with the pen and the brush switched. All right, so there's our method, or our result, and it looks kind of funny. The reason is I haven't overridden the draw methods for the shape class in the shape ellipse class. So the shape rectangle class is good to go. That's what these black rectangles are. But the shape ellipse class, it doesn't provide its own draw method, so it's falling back to the version implemented by the shape class, which draws a big red rectangle with an X through it. So let's fix that. We'll go over here to the shape ellipse class, and we'll give it the methods that it needs. So first what we need to do is we'll do a public override. And notice at this point, IntelliSense will show us all the things that we could override. So down here is toString, which we've used before, and then here are the two draw methods. So let's override this one first. Right now it's calling the base class's version. Let's get rid of that. And what we want this thing to do is draw our ellipse for us. So I'm going to say fill ellipse, and we need to pass it the brush that we've been given, and our rectangle. Well, our rectangle is defined by bounds, so that's all there is to this one. Then gr.draw ellipse, we need to pass it the pen we've been given and also the bounds. So there's our the full version of draw. Now let's override the other version. So public override, and we'll do this version this time. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call the other draw version just like we did before, just like we did in the base class. Oh, sorry. Here we need to use our default. So pens dot black and brushes dot transparent. So now if we run the program, the ellipse should draw as an ellipse instead of using the default shape behavior. If I check the color checkbox, it redraws, this time filling everything with the light blue background. And because I created them in the right order, that's why the hat looks like it's on top of the face instead of the eyeballs being on top of the hat. Let me show you one more thing, which I mentioned in the text, but I'll show it to you here. If you look very closely, you'll see that these lines are somewhat jagged. And when we fill it, you can't tell in the middle so well, but along the edges you can see that they're a little bit rough. We can make that smoother. The way to do that is go into the paint event handler, and before we do any drawing right here, we'll say e.graphics.smoothing mode equals anti-alias. So what that does is it says whenever you're drawing lines or shapes or filling them, use this technique called anti-aliasing to make the edges smoother. So now let's run the program again, and you can see the jagged edges are greatly reduced. They're still there a little bit if you look extremely closely, but it looks much nicer.